The rain poured mercilessly from the leaden sky as Rebecca Hayes stood at the edge of Sweetwater's only train platform, her sodden blue dress clinging to her shivering form. She had been waiting for 6 hours straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the tracks disappeared into the stormy distance. It was April 1875, and the Arizona Territory's unpredictable spring weather had turned what should have been the happiest day of her life into a test of endurance and faith. "He promised," she whispered to herself, clutching a wrinkled telegram in her gloved hand. The paper had long since become a soggy mess, but she knew the words by heart. Thomas would arrive on the 2 o'clock train from Tucson with the ring he'd gone to purchase. They would be married by sunset. That had been the plan, but the 2 o'clock train had come and gone without Thomas. So had the 4 o'clock. And now the station master had locked up for the night, leaving Rebecca alone with nothing but the drumming rain and the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. The town of Sweetwater had mostly emptied as the storm intensified. Shop owners had closed early, and the usual bustle of the main street had been reduced to occasional splashes as someone hurried from one building to another. Rebecca hardly noticed. Her 22 years had not prepared her for this particular brand of heartache, the kind that comes not from rejection, but from uncertainty. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats over the rain, didn't notice the tall figure on horseback until he had already dismounted and was standing just a few feet away. "Miss," the deep voice startled her. "Miss Hayes." Rebecca turned, blinking rainwater from her eyes to see a man in a dark duster and wide-brimmed hat. The collar of his coat was turned up against the rain, but she could see he had a strong jaw, partly covered by a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes were the color of a summer sky, startling in their clarity. "How do you know my name?" she asked, instinctively stepping back. "Everyone in town knows who you are," he said, his voice gentler now. "I'm Vincent Irving. I just rode in from Tucson." He hesitated, then added, "You've been standing here for hours. I saw you when I passed through town this morning." Rebecca's heart leapt. "You've come from Tucson. Did you see Thomas Wilcox? He was supposed to be on the afternoon train." Vincent's expression shifted subtly, and Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. "Miss Hayes," he said carefully, "there wasn't any train from Tucson today. The bridge at Coyote Creek washed out yesterday." "No, that can't be right," Rebecca protested. "Thomas sent a telegram. He said—" "The telegraph lines went down in the same storm," Vincent interrupted. His eyes held a mixture of sympathy and something else, a resolve that seemed out of place. "Miss Hayes, Rebecca, you've waited enough." Rebecca stared at him, uncomprehending. "What do you mean?" Vincent took a deep breath. "I think we should get you somewhere warm and dry, then we need to talk." "About Thomas?" "Yes," Vincent said, "about Thomas, and about why I really came to Sweetwater." Rebecca wanted to refuse, to stay rooted to this spot until Thomas appeared. But her body betrayed her with a violent shiver, and she realized the futility of her vigil. "My house is just down the street," she said finally. "I can make coffee." Vincent nodded and offered his arm. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, allowing him to guide her through the rain-slicked streets of Sweetwater, away from the platform where her dreams had begun to drown in the relentless downpour. As they walked, Rebecca couldn't help but notice how steady Vincent's arm felt beneath her fingers, how he adjusted his stride to match hers, and how carefully he guided her around puddles. These small courtesies only intensified her anxiety about what he might have to tell her. Rebecca's home was a modest 2-story structure on Maple Street, its white clapboard exterior gleaming dully in the rain. It had been her parents' house before they passed away 2 years ago, leaving her alone but independent, rare for an unmarried woman in the Arizona Territory. Once inside, Rebecca lit a lamp and excused herself to change out of her wet clothes. Vincent stood awkwardly in her small parlor, removing his hat and coat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean, muscular build of a man accustomed to physical labor, though his manner suggested education and refinement. Rebecca returned wearing a simple brown dress, her damp auburn hair now pinned into a loose bun. She bustled about, stoking the fire in the small stove and preparing coffee, delaying the moment when she would have to hear whatever news Vincent brought. When she could delay no longer, she set 2 steaming cups on the small table between them and took a seat opposite Vincent. "Please," she said quietly, "tell me what you know about Thomas." Vincent wrapped his hands around the warm cup but didn't drink. "Thomas Wilcox isn't coming to Sweetwater, Miss Hayes. Has something happened to him?" Fear clutched at her heart. Vincent's jaw tightened. "Not in the way you're thinking. Thomas Wilcox is alive and well, but he isn't the man you believe him to be." Rebecca frowned. "I don't understand." "I'm a detective with the Pinkerton Agency," Vincent said, reaching inside his vest to produce a small leather wallet containing his credentials. "I've been tracking Thomas Wilcox for nearly 6 months now." The coffee cup trembled in Rebecca's hands. "A detective? Why would a detective be tracking Thomas?" "Because Thomas Wilcox is actually Edward Thornton, wanted in 4 states for fraud and theft." Vincent's voice was gentle but matter-of-fact. "His scheme is always the same. He finds a respectable young woman, preferably one with property or money of her own. He courts her, proposes marriage, then disappears with whatever valuables he can get his hands on." Rebecca set her cup down with a clatter, coffee sloshing over the rim. "No, you're mistaken. Thomas loves me. We're to be married." Her voice broke on the last word. "I wish I were mistaken," Vincent said, "but I've spoken to 5 other women who believed the same thing." "He was engaged to a woman in Santa Fe just last month." "That's impossible. Thomas has been here in Sweetwater since January." "No, he hasn't. He's been traveling between here and other towns. Those business trips he told you about, he was visiting his other interests." Rebecca stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the rain continued to fall in sheets. "Why should I believe you? I don't know you. You appear out of nowhere with this outlandish story." Vincent reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small packet of papers. "These are statements from his other victims. And this," he added, placing a small photograph on the table, "was taken 3 weeks ago in Santa Fe. That's Thomas or Edward with Miss Sarah Landry, to whom he was allegedly engaged." Rebecca approached slowly, almost against her will, and picked up the photograph. Even in the poor quality of the image, there was no mistaking Thomas's handsome face, his arm wrapped possessively around a pretty blonde woman who gazed up at him adoringly. Rebecca sank back into her chair, the photograph fluttering from her fingers to the table. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why me? I'm not wealthy. This house is all I have." "But you have the house," Vincent pointed out gently. "A property deed in your name, that's valuable enough." Rebecca pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to process this betrayal. "He asked me for the deed last week, said he needed it to arrange our mortgage after the wedding." She gave a bitter laugh. "I was going to give it to him tomorrow. Then I arrived just in time," Vincent said. Rebecca looked up at him through tear-filled eyes. "Did you catch him? Is he in custody?" Vincent's expression darkened. "Not yet. I tracked him to Tucson, but he gave me the slip. That's why I came here. I knew this was his next target. You were his next target. And now I continue tracking him. He won't get far. There's a significant reward for his capture, and I've alerted law enforcement throughout the territory." Rebecca stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. 6 months of her life, wasted on a man who had never intended to marry her, who had seen her only as another mark in his long line of deceptions. The humiliation was almost as painful as the heartbreak. "What will you do now?" Vincent asked after a long silence. "I don't know," Rebecca admitted. "I've been so focused on the wedding, on our future together, I never imagined." Her voice trailed off. Vincent leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Miss Hayes, I know this is difficult news to hear, especially from a stranger. But you should know that you're not alone in being deceived by this man. He's very good at what he does." Rebecca nodded numbly. Will you stay in Sweetwater until he's caught? That's my intention. I believe he'll return once the storm passes, thinking his plan is still in place. When he does, I'll be waiting. Rebecca wiped away a tear that had escaped despite her best efforts. Then I suppose I should be grateful you arrived when you did, Mr. Irving. Vincent, please. Vincent. She attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Well, Vincent, it seems I owe you my gratitude and perhaps the deed to my house as well. You owe me nothing, Miss Hayes. I'm simply doing my job. But as their eyes met across the small table, with the rain drumming on the roof and the fire crackling in the stove, both felt a strange connection forming one born of unusual circumstances, but genuine nonetheless. The storm continued through the night and into the next day. Vincent took a room at the Sweetwater Hotel, but spent most of his time with Rebecca, helping her understand the full extent of Thomas's deception. Together they went through letters and gifts he had given her, Vincent pointing out inconsistencies and fabrications that Rebecca had been too besotted to notice. This letter, Vincent said, holding up a cream-colored page, where he describes his family ranch in Colorado. It's almost word for word what he told Miss Landry in Santa Fe, except he placed it in Texas for her. Rebecca shook her head in disbelief. I feel so foolish. Don't, Vincent said firmly. Men like Thomas or Edward are skilled manipulators. They know exactly what to say, how to present themselves. Your only mistake was being kind and trusting. 3 days after Vincent's arrival, the rain finally stopped, and the sun emerged to begin drying Sweetwater's muddy streets. The telegraph lines were repaired, and Vincent received word that the railroad bridge would be passable within a week. You really think he'll come back? Rebecca asked as they walked along the main street, nodding to curious townspeople who had noticed their frequent companionship. I do, Vincent said. He's invested too much time in you to simply abandon the scheme. My guess is he'll arrive with some dramatic story about being delayed or injured. And then what? Then I arrest him, and you get to watch him face justice. Rebecca considered this. I'm not sure that's what I want anymore. Vincent looked at her questioningly. I mean, yes, I want him caught and punished, she clarified, but I don't need to witness it. The past few days have been enlightening. I feel as though I've awakened from a pleasant dream, but a false one nonetheless. That's a remarkably healthy perspective, Vincent observed. Rebecca smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time since they'd met. Perhaps. Or perhaps I simply want to move forward rather than dwelling on my mistakes. As they passed the general store, the owner, Mrs. Patterson, emerged and waved them over. Rebecca, dear, I haven't seen you since before the storm. Are you well? And who is your handsome friend? Rebecca introduced Vincent as a business associate from Tucson, smoothly explaining that he was helping her with some property matters. If Mrs. Patterson suspected there was more to the story, she kept it to herself, merely commenting that it was nice to see Rebecca in good spirits considering the circumstances. What did she mean by that? Vincent asked as they continued their walk. Rebecca sighed. News travels fast in Sweetwater. Everyone knew Thomas and I were to be married. Now everyone knows he didn't arrive as planned. I'm sure there are already rumors. Does that bother you? Less than I would have expected, Rebecca admitted. A week ago I would have been mortified. Now it seems less important somehow. They had reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open landscape. The storm had transformed the usually arid terrain into a temporary oasis of green, with wildflowers beginning to bloom across the desert floor. It's beautiful, Vincent remarked. I've spent so much time chasing Thornton across the Southwest that I've rarely taken time to appreciate the landscape. Being a detective must be a lonely profession, Rebecca observed. Vincent's gaze remained on the distant mountains. It can be. Always moving, never putting down roots. But it suits me, I suppose, or it did. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. I've been considering a change, perhaps something more settled. Rebecca felt a flutter in her chest that she immediately tried to suppress. This man was still essentially a stranger, regardless of how much time they'd spent together in recent days. "What would you do instead?" she asked. "I have some savings. Enough to buy a small ranch, perhaps. I grew up on a farm in Missouri. I know my way around livestock. Here in Arizona." Vincent smiled. "It's as good a place as any. Better than most, in fact. The territory is growing and there's opportunity for those willing to work hard." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. Then Vincent straightened, his demeanor shifting subtly. "We should head back. I need to send some telegrams, make sure the authorities in Tucson are still on alert." As they walked back toward town, Rebecca found herself wondering what it would be like if Vincent did stay in Arizona, perhaps even in Sweetwater. The thought brought a warmth to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. The following morning, Rebecca was arranging flowers in her parlor when a knock came at her door. Expecting Vincent, who had promised to bring news from the telegraph office, she was startled to find Thomas Wilcox standing on her porch. "Rebecca, my love," he exclaimed, stepping forward to embrace her. Rebecca instinctively stepped back, her heart racing. Thomas looked exactly as she remembered, handsome, with warm brown eyes and a charming smile that now seemed sinister rather than endearing. "Thomas," she managed to say, "you're here." "Of course I'm here. Did you think I would abandon my bride-to-be?" His expression shifted to one of concern. "I tried to send word, but the telegraph lines were down. The train couldn't get through because of the bridge, so I had to hire a horse in Tucson and ride the whole way. It was dreadful. I was nearly swept away crossing Coyote Creek." Rebecca stared at him, seeing for the first time the calculated nature of his performance. Every gesture, every expression was designed to elicit sympathy and admiration. "You must be exhausted," she said, falling back on social niceties while her mind raced. "Where was Vincent?" "Would you like to come in for coffee?" "I would love nothing more," Thomas said, following her inside. "I've thought of nothing but returning to you, my dear. The delay was torturous." As Rebecca busied herself with the coffee pot, trying to keep her hands from shaking, Thomas prowled around the parlor, picking up objects and setting them down. "I was worried when you weren't at the station to meet me," he said. "But then, you couldn't have known when I'd arrive." "No," Rebecca agreed, her back to him as she measured coffee into the pot. "I couldn't have known." "I have wonderful news," Thomas continued. "I've secured a buyer for this house, a very generous offer. Once we're married, we can use the money to establish ourselves in California. I've always told you how beautiful San Francisco is in the spring." Rebecca turned slowly. "You found a buyer for my house," Thomas smiled broadly. "Indeed, a business associate from my time in Denver. He's looking for investment properties in growing towns. We're in luck. He's actually in Tucson now and can complete the transaction before our wedding. All we need is the deed, and we can be on our way to a new life together." "The deed," Rebecca repeated. "You want the deed to my house?" Something in her tone must have alerted Thomas that all was not well. His expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Rebecca, darling, is something wrong? You seem different. No, I don't think so. Perhaps just more observant." Thomas took a step toward her. "What does that mean?" The front door opened before Rebecca could respond, and Vincent stepped into the parlor. He assessed the situation at a glance, his hand moving to rest on the pistol at his hip. "Edward Thornton," he said calmly. "You're under arrest for fraud and theft in the territories of New Mexico and Arizona, and the states of Texas and Colorado." Thomas Edward froze for only a moment before lunging toward the back door. But Vincent had anticipated this move and was faster, tackling the smaller man to the ground. There was a brief struggle before Vincent subdued him, pinning him face down on Rebecca's parlor floor. "Rebecca, there are handcuffs in my coat pocket," Vincent said, his voice strained as he wrestled to keep Thornton immobilized. Rebecca retrieved the handcuffs and handed them to Vincent, who efficiently secured the prisoner's wrists behind his back. "This is absurd," Thornton protested as Vincent pulled him to his feet. "Rebecca, tell him who I am." Rebecca looked into the face of the man she had thought she loved and felt nothing but a dull ache of disappointment. "I believe you're Edward Thornton," she said quietly. "And I believe you never loved me at all." Thornton's expression twisted with anger. "You stupid woman. Of course I didn't love you. Why would anyone love a plain, provincial nobody like you? You were convenient, nothing more." Vincent's hand tightened on Thornton's arm. "That's enough," he said, his voice hard. "It's all right," Rebecca said, surprisingly calm in the face of Thornton's cruelty. "His opinion matters very little to me now." Vincent's eyes met hers with a look of admiration. "I'll take him to the sheriff's office. Will you be all right?" Rebecca nodded. "I'll be fine. Go." As Vincent marched the protesting Thornton out the door, Rebecca sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking. She didn't cry for the loss of Thomas. She now understood that the man she had loved had never existed. Instead, she wept for her own naivety, for the dreams she had built around a foundation of lies. By the time Vincent returned, she had dried her tears and was sitting on her porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "It's done," Vincent said, taking a seat beside her. "The sheriff has him locked up. There will be a hearing tomorrow, and then he'll be transferred to Tucson to stand trial." "Thank you," Rebecca said simply. They sat in silence for a while, the evening air cooling around them. "What will you do now?" Rebecca finally asked. "Chase another criminal across the frontier." Vincent gazed at the darkening sky. "Actually, I've decided to resign from the Pinkerton agency." Rebecca turned to look at him, surprised. "Because of what you said yesterday." "About wanting to settle down," partly, Vincent admitted. "But also because this case, it affected me differently than others have." "How so?" Vincent seemed to choose his words carefully. "I've been tracking Thornton for months. I've interviewed his victims, collected evidence, followed his trail across half the Southwest. But it was all abstract in a way, until I saw you standing in the rain, waiting for a man who was never going to come. Something about your faith, your loyalty, even though it was misplaced, it made me see the human cost of his crimes more clearly." Rebecca wasn't sure how to respond to this unexpected confession. "So you'll buy that ranch you mentioned?" "I'm considering it. There's a property about 10 miles outside of Sweetwater that's for sale. Good water rights, decent grazing land. You'd stay here, in Sweetwater." Vincent turned to face her, his expression earnest. "Would that be unwelcome?" Rebecca felt a warmth spreading through her chest. "No," she said softly. "It wouldn't be unwelcome at all." The weeks following Edward Thornton's arrest were transformative for Sweetwater and for Rebecca. Initially, there had been whispers and pitying glances as news of her narrow escape from the conman spread through town. But as details emerged about Thornton's other victims, including women from much more sophisticated cities than Sweetwater, the narrative shifted. Rebecca was no longer seen as a naive girl who had been fooled, but as a woman who had shown remarkable resilience in the face of betrayal. For his part, Vincent became something of a local hero. After testifying at Thornton's hearing in Sweetwater, he traveled to Tucson for the trial, returning 2 weeks later with news that Thornton had been sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. During Vincent's absence, Rebecca had found herself missing his company with an intensity that surprised her. They had known each other for such a short time, yet he had become important to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. When he returned from Tucson, Vincent called on Rebecca immediately. She received him in her parlor, suddenly self-conscious about her simple dress and the modest furnishings of her home. "You're back," she said, stating the obvious. "I am." Vincent smiled, and Rebecca noticed how his entire face transformed when he did so. "And I have news." "About Thornton?" "No, about me." Vincent took a deep breath. "I've purchased the Jenkins Ranch. It's official as of yesterday." Rebecca's heart leapt. "You're staying in Sweetwater?" "I am." "The former owner is moving to California to live with his daughter, so he was motivated to sell quickly. The price was fair, and the land is good, better than I'd hoped, actually." "That's wonderful news," Rebecca said sincerely. "When do you take possession?" "Immediately." Mr. Jenkins has already moved out. I'll be staying at the hotel for another week while I purchase supplies and hire a few hands, then I'll move to the ranch." Vincent hesitated, then added, "I was hoping you might come out to see it sometime. Give me your opinion on what needs improving." "My opinion? I don't know anything about ranching." "No, but you know about making a house into a home. The main house is solid but neglected. It needs a woman's touch." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Rebecca felt her cheeks grow warm, but she met his gaze steadily. "I would be happy to offer whatever advice I can." Vincent's smile widened. "Excellent. Perhaps this Sunday I could come for you around noon. Sunday would be perfect." After Vincent left, Rebecca stood for a long time in her parlor, a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension swirling within her. She had sworn to herself after Thornton's betrayal that she would never again be so easily won over by a man's attention. Yet here she was, her pulse quickening at the mere thought of spending an afternoon with Vincent. But Vincent was different, she told herself. He had proven himself honorable and kind. And unlike Thomas Edward, who had appeared in her life suddenly and charmed her with grand stories and promises, Vincent had been forthright from the beginning. Even his interest in her, if indeed that was what this invitation signified, had developed naturally over time rather than through calculated seduction. Sunday arrived clear and warm, the kind of perfect spring day that made the desert bloom. Vincent appeared at Rebecca's door promptly at noon, driving a wagon rather than riding his usual horse. "I thought this would be more comfortable for you," he explained as he helped her up to the seat. The drive to the Jenkins ranch, now the Irving Ranch, Rebecca reminded herself took just over an hour. As they left Sweetwater behind, the conversation flowed easily between them. Vincent told her about his childhood in Missouri, about his 3 sisters and his parents' farm. Rebecca shared stories of growing up in Sweetwater, of her father's work as the town doctor and her mother's involvement in establishing the first school. "They sound like remarkable people," Vincent said. "They must have been proud of you." Rebecca's smile was tinged with sadness. "I hope they were. They died within months of each other 2 years ago, influenza." Vincent's hand briefly covered hers where it rested on the seat between them. "I'm sorry, that must have been very difficult." "It was, but they left me independent, which is more than many women my age can say. My father believed in education for girls. He made sure I could manage the household accounts, understand legal documents, make my own decisions. A progressive thinker." "Very much so. My mother, too, she was teaching at the Territorial College in Tucson when they met. She gave up her position when they married, but she never stopped learning or teaching." "And now you're a teacher as well, I understand," Rebecca nodded. "At the Sweetwater School, I teach the older children 12 to 16-year-olds. It's challenging sometimes, but I love it." "Will you continue teaching now that?" "Well, now that your plans have changed." "You mean now that I'm not marrying a conman and moving to California?" Rebecca said wryly. "Yes, I intend to keep teaching. In fact, I've just been appointed head teacher beginning next term." Vincent looked impressed. "Congratulations, that's quite an achievement." "Thank you. It's not what I expected for my life, but I'm finding that unexpected paths can lead to satisfying destinations." Their eyes met briefly before Vincent returned his attention to the road. "We're nearly there," he said. "Just over that rise." As the wagon crested the hill, Rebecca gasped at the view that spread before them. The ranch house sat in a natural depression, sheltered by rocky outcroppings on 3 sides. A creek still flowing strongly after the recent rains curved around the property, its banks lined with cottonwood trees. Beyond the house and outbuildings, grassland stretched toward distant mountains, the spring growth giving the landscape a soft, green appearance that would turn golden by summer. "Vincent, it's beautiful," Rebecca breathed. "You think so?" His voice held a note of genuine pleasure at her approval. "I thought it had potential, but I wasn't sure if others would see it the same way." "It's not just potential, it's already lovely. The setting alone is worth whatever you paid." Vincent guided the wagon down the slope toward the ranch house. As they drew closer, Rebecca could see that while the house was indeed solid, it showed signs of neglect: peeling paint, a sagging porch step, shutters hanging askew. "I told you it needed work," Vincent said, noticing the direction of her gaze. "Nothing that can't be fixed," Rebecca assured him. They spent the afternoon exploring the property. Vincent showed her the barn, the corral, the small bunkhouse where the ranch hands would stay. The main house was larger than Rebecca had expected, 6 rooms in all, including a spacious kitchen with a cast-iron stove that Rebecca immediately coveted. "It's twice the size of mine," she said, running her hand appreciatively over the enameled surface. Mrs. Jenkins was apparently quite the cook, Vincent explained. Her husband said she insisted on the best stove money could buy. She had good taste. By late afternoon, they had toured the entire property, and Vincent had made notes of Rebecca's suggestions for improvements to the house. They sat on the porch, drinking lemonade that Vincent had thoughtfully packed along with a simple picnic lunch. "Thank you for coming today," Vincent said. "Your input has been invaluable." "It was my pleasure. This is a special place, Vincent. You were right to buy it." Vincent leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. "When I first joined the Pinkerton agency, I thought it would be exciting tracking criminals, bringing them to justice. And it was for a time. But eventually I realized I was spending my life chasing after the worst aspects of human nature. It wears on a person." "I can imagine it would," Rebecca said softly. "This place represents something different, creation rather than pursuit. Building something rather than merely preventing destruction." He gestured toward the land spreading out before them. "In 5 years, this could be one of the most productive ranches in the territory. In 10, it could support 100 head of cattle, maybe more." "It sounds like you've found your calling." Vincent turned to look at her directly. "I hope so, but a ranch is more than land and livestock. It's a home, and a home needs—" He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "A home needs people who care about it," Rebecca finished for him. "People who love it, who are invested in its future." "Yes," Vincent agreed, his eyes never leaving hers. "Exactly that." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Vincent cleared his throat and stood up. "We should head back to town before it gets too late." The ride back to Sweetwater was quieter than the journey out, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the outskirts of town, Vincent finally broke the silence. "Rebecca, I know we haven't known each other very long and you've had good reason lately to be cautious about men and their intentions, but I want you to know that I've come to care for you, very much." Rebecca's heart quickened. "I've come to care for you too, Vincent." "I'm not asking for any commitments," he hastened to add. "I know you need time, but I wanted you to know how I feel and that my feelings are sincere." Rebecca reached out and placed her hand on his arm. "I believe you, Vincent, and I don't need as much time as you might think. The past few weeks have taught me to trust my own judgment again, and my judgment tells me that you are a good man, the kind of man worth knowing better." Vincent's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Then perhaps you would allow me to call on you properly. We could attend church together next Sunday, and perhaps dinner afterward." "I would like that very much." As Vincent helped her down from the wagon in front of her house, their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary. No promises had been made, no declarations of love exchanged, but something had shifted between them, a door opening to possibilities neither had anticipated when they first met in the rain. Over the next few months, Vincent divided his time between establishing his ranch and courting Rebecca. Their courtship was unhurried and transparent, conducted in full view of Sweetwater's curious but approving population. They attended church together on Sundays, took meals at the hotel dining room, and enjoyed long walks on summer evenings when the heat of the day had dissipated. Rebecca visited the ranch regularly, watching as Vincent transformed it from a neglected property into a thriving enterprise. He had hired 4 hands, all local men with families in Sweetwater, and purchased a small herd of cattle to start his operation. By August, the main house had been completely renovated. Fresh paint, repaired shutters, new furniture ordered from Tucson, and curtains sewn by Rebecca herself had transformed the once shabby building into an inviting home. "It's looking more like you every day," Vincent said as they stood in the newly furnished parlor, like me, warm, welcoming, beautiful without being showy. Rebecca blushed at the compliment. "I've enjoyed helping with it." "Perhaps too much. I find myself thinking of this place as partly mine, which is presumptuous of me." Vincent took her hands in his. "Not presumptuous at all. I've been hoping you would think of it that way." He took a deep breath. "Rebecca, I know we agreed to take things slowly and I've tried to be patient. But the truth is, I fell in love with you that first day when I saw you standing in the rain, refusing to give up on someone you believed in." Rebecca's eyes widened. "You never told me that. How could I?" "You were heartbroken, betrayed. The last thing you needed was another man making declarations. But now," he squeezed her hands gently, "now I hope enough time has passed that you might consider a future with me, here on this ranch, as my wife." For a moment, Rebecca's mind flashed back to Thomas's proposal, the practiced speech, the calculating look in his eyes that she had mistaken for passion. There was nothing calculated about Vincent's proposal. His hands were actually trembling slightly in hers, his eyes vulnerable and hopeful. "Vincent," she said softly, "I would be honored to be your wife." The joy that spread across his face was answer enough, but he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "I love you, Rebecca Hayes," he whispered against her hair. "I think I've loved you from the moment I saw you standing in that rain, soaked to the skin but still believing in love." "And I love you, Vincent Irving," she replied. "Not because you rescued me from a terrible mistake, but because of who you are: honest, kind, hardworking. The man who saw me at my lowest moment and still found something worth cherishing." They were married in October 1875 in Sweetwater's small church. The entire town turned out for the wedding, which was followed by a celebration at the newly completed Irving Ranch. Rebecca wore a simple gown of ivory silk, adorned with lace that Mrs. Patterson had ordered specially from San Francisco. Vincent, resplendent in a new black suit, couldn't take his eyes off his bride throughout the ceremony. As they danced under the stars that evening, surrounded by the community that had embraced them both, Rebecca thought about the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. "What are you thinking about?" Vincent asked, noting her contemplative expression. "I was thinking about that day in the rain," she admitted. "How devastated I was when Thomas didn't arrive, how certain I was that my life was ruined, and now I'm grateful that he never came." Vincent smiled. "I'm rather grateful myself. Do you think we would have met otherwise?" "I like to think so. Perhaps not in such dramatic circumstances, but Sweetwater is a small town. Our paths would have crossed eventually." Rebecca laid her head against his chest as they swayed to the music. "I'm glad we didn't have to leave it to chance." Their first year of marriage was one of adjustment and growth. Rebecca continued teaching at the Sweetwater School while learning the intricacies of managing a ranch household. Vincent's herd grew, as did his reputation as a fair employer and shrewd businessman. They established traditions that blended their separate lives into a shared one. Sunday dinners at the ranch for friends from town. Quiet evenings reading aloud to each other beside the fire. Moonlight rides across their property, reveling in the beauty of the desert night. In the spring of 1876, Rebecca discovered she was expecting their first child. The news brought both joy and apprehension. Childbirth in the territories was often dangerous, and the nearest doctor was in Tucson, a full day's ride away. "Perhaps we should move to town until after the baby comes," Vincent suggested, concern evident in his voice, but Rebecca was adamant. "This is our home, Vincent. This is where our child should be born." To compromise, Vincent arranged for a midwife from Tucson to come stay at the ranch for the last month of Rebecca's pregnancy. Mrs. Alvarez, a skilled Mexican-American midwife with 30 years of experience, arrived in November, bringing comfort and competence to the nervous parents-to-be. On a cold December morning, after a long night of labor, Rebecca gave birth to a son. They named him James after Vincent's father, with the middle name of Michael, in honor of Rebecca's father. As Rebecca cradled their newborn son, with Vincent sitting beside them on the bed they shared, she felt a completeness she had never known before. "He's perfect," Vincent whispered, gently touching his son's tiny fingers. "He is," Rebecca agreed, "and he's ours, our family." The years that followed brought both challenges and blessings. The ranch prospered, expanding to include orchards and fields of alfalfa in addition to the growing cattle operation. A daughter, Elizabeth, joined the family in 1878, followed by another son, William, in 1881. Sweetwater grew as well, transforming from a small settlement into a proper town with a bank, a school building, and even a small newspaper. Rebecca eventually gave up teaching to focus on raising their children and managing the increasing social responsibilities that came with Vincent's position as one of the area's most successful ranchers. In the summer of 1885, a decade after they first met, Vincent and Rebecca stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching their children play in the yard. James, now 9, was teaching 7-year-old Elizabeth to throw a lasso, while 4-year-old William toddled after them, determined to keep up. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if it hadn't rained that day?" Rebecca asked, leaning against Vincent's shoulder. "What do you mean? If it had been sunny, I might not have looked so pitiful standing at that train station. You might have ridden right past without stopping." Vincent chuckled, wrapping his arm around her waist. "I would have stopped, rain or shine. Some things are meant to be, Rebecca. Like us, especially us." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "But I'm still glad it rained. It makes for a better story to tell the children." Rebecca smiled, watching as James successfully taught Elizabeth to twirl the small rope above her head. "I stood in the rain waiting for a man who never came," she said softly, "and then a cowboy rode up and told me I'd waited enough." "Best thing I ever said," Vincent murmured. "Though I do comes in a close second." As the sun began to set over their land, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple, Rebecca thought about how differently her life might have turned out if she hadn't stood in that rain, if Vincent hadn't found her, if she had given Thomas the deed to her house as planned. Sometimes, she realized, what seems like heartbreak is actually the beginning of something beautiful. Sometimes getting drenched in a rainstorm leads you exactly where you need to be. "Come on," Vincent said, taking her hand. "Let's call the children in for supper." Together, they walked down the steps toward their family, their future, and the life they had built from an unexpected beginning, a life far richer and more fulfilling than either could have imagined on that rainy day in Sweetwater all those years ago. In 1890, the Irving Ranch hosted a grand celebration for Vincent and Rebecca's 15th wedding anniversary. Friends and neighbors from miles around gathered to honor the couple who had become pillars of the community. The ranch itself had grown to encompass over 5,000 acres, with a herd of several hundred cattle, orchards of peach and apple trees, and fields of alfalfa and corn. Sweetwater, too, had prospered. The railroad had finally built a proper station, connecting the town more firmly to Tucson and points east. New businesses had opened, including a dressmaker's shop run by Rebecca's former student, Sarah Whitman. As dusk fell on the celebration, lanterns were lit throughout the ranch yard, and musicians struck up a lively tune. Vincent led Rebecca onto the makeshift dance floor, just as he had on their wedding night. 15 years, he mused as they moved together, as in sync now as they had been that first night. "It seems both a lifetime and the blink of an eye." "The best kind of lifetime," Rebecca replied, her eyes shining in the lantern light. From the edge of the dance floor, their children watched with varying degrees of interest. James, now 14 and increasingly serious about his future role in managing the ranch, stood with his father's foreman, deep in conversation about cattle breeds. Elizabeth, 12 and already showing signs of her mother's intelligence and determination, sat with a book propped surreptitiously on her lap, stealing paragraphs between social obligations. And young William, 8 years old and full of mischief, was attempting to convince his cousin's Vincent's sister's children, visiting from Missouri to explore the barn loft in the dark. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the children were asleep, Vincent and Rebecca sat on their porch as they had done countless evenings before. The desert night was clear, stars scattered across the velvet sky like diamonds. "I have something for you," Vincent said, reaching into his pocket. "A 15th anniversary present." He handed her a small velvet box. Inside was a gold locket, intricately engraved with vines and flowers. When Rebecca opened it, she found a tiny photograph of the two of them on one side and their 3 children on the other. "Vincent, it's beautiful," she breathed. "Open the back," he urged. Rebecca turned the locket over and discovered another compartment. Inside was a folded slip of paper, yellowed with age. Carefully, she extracted and unfolded it. This is the telegram," she said, recognizing the faded message that Thomas Wilcox had sent her all those years ago, promising to arrive on the train with her engagement ring. "Where did you get this?" "You kept it," Vincent explained. "I found it in a box of keepsakes when we were moving your things from your house in town. I hope you don't mind that I saved it." "But why?" Vincent took her hand, his expression tender in the moonlight. "Because without this telegram, you wouldn't have been standing in the rain that day. Without the rain, I might not have noticed you at the station. Without noticing you, I might not have found the courage to speak to you. And without speaking to you, I wouldn't have discovered the most remarkable woman I've ever known, the woman who became my wife, the mother of my children, the heart of our home." Tears welled in Rebecca's eyes. "You romantic fool," she said affectionately. "Only you would give your wife a reminder of another man's false promises as an anniversary gift," Vincent laughed. "When you put it that way, it does sound rather odd, but I prefer to think of it as a reminder of how the worst days can lead to the best lives." Rebecca tucked the telegram back into the locket and closed it carefully. "I'll treasure it always, not for what it was, but for what it led to." As they sat together in the peaceful night, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a rain-soaked platform to this thriving ranch, from heartbreak to profound joy, it was a path she could never have imagined that day in 1875. "What do you think the next 15 years will bring?" she asked softly. Vincent squeezed her hand. "More of this, I hope. Our children growing into the fine adults they're already becoming. The ranch continuing to prosper. You and I growing old together on this land we love. That sounds perfect." And as they sat hand in hand beneath the vast Arizona sky, Rebecca knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, the woman who had once waited in the rain, and the cowboy who had told her she'd waited enough.